right, after reports for months and months that Russia was attempting to hack the U.S. power grid, those have all been totally exaggerated and debunked. Today, we are learning that it's actually the U.S. which has deployed, quote, American computer code into Russian power grid systems. That report from the New York Times following National Security Advisor John Bolton's comments last week, citing the U.S. would take a more aggressive offensive stance, saying, quote, anyone engaged in cyber ops against the U.S. would pay the price. So joining us to break it all down, investigative journalist Ben Swann. Ben, my friend, good to see you. So do you recall earlier this year, Rachel Maddow, the media's premier anti-Russia show host, she had this to say.
This is the director of national intelligence telling us all in unclassified form, in black and white, China and Russia can do this today, now, whenever they want to. In other words, we're relying on their good graces that they're not. And it is like negative 50 degrees in the Dakotas right now. What would happen if Russia killed the power in Fargo today? Right? What would happen if all the natural gas lines that service Sioux Falls just poofed on the coldest day in recent memory, and it wasn't in our power whether or not to turn them back on? I mean, what would you do?
All right, Ben, you remember that famous statement there?
Yes.
We know now that was all false and debunked, but in psychological terms, what we're witnessing now is called projection. Turns out the U.S. has dropped some malware into Russia's power grid. What is your take on this turn of events?
Well, you make a great point. I'm so glad that you guys pulled that soundbite to run it again. We were able to debunk that within a day or so. Even the language that Rachel Maddow used was very misleading. The report itself never said that Russia could. It said they might be able to affect gas lines in one particular area. So it wasn't at all what she was claiming. Having said that, it goes back to what we now know, which is what you're saying, that there is American code that's been found on these Russian servers. And essentially the U.S., it seems like bragging almost to the New York Times that the U.S. has been engaged in this process of hacking and trying to interfere with the Russian power grid. So a lot of concern about not only when this report came out, why it's come out, who's involved in it, and perhaps the biggest question of all, what seemed to be bragging that President Trump may not even know about it, and that U.S. Cyber Command under the Pentagon is conducting these attacks against the Russian power grid without his knowledge. That's extremely concerning.
Oh, yeah. And you know, Ben, on the media side, I wonder if Rachel Maddow is going to readdress this because this is in direct correlation to what she had to say just earlier this year in January. I don't know if she's aware, but it's pretty damn cold in parts of Russia, too, all year round. So maybe that's something that she should point out. And you know, Ben, back here, there are new laws enacted by Congress just last year that, quote, allow clandestine military activity, at least in the cybersphere, but it's very broad language, the way it's written. Talk a bit about how this could impact us, the civilians at home.
Well, everything you're describing affects civilians here in the United States, and it affects civilians in Russia. Look, whenever you have military powers who are affecting power grids in other countries, those are not acts of war committed against military. Those are acts of war committed against civilians, affecting the lives of civilians. And so even though it sounds like, oh, these are cyber attacks, it's not the same thing as war, it can be in some cases much more serious than outright war because of the effect that you have on civilian populations. So it is hugely concerning in that respect. As you mentioned, these clandestine operations have been approved by Congress. The language is broad, but it does not appear that those clandestine operations are supposed to be occurring outside of the purview of the president, the commander-in-chief. And if the commander-in-chief is not aware, the question becomes this: who is authorizing these military and clandestine operations in terms of cyber attacks? Who is responsible for it if it is not the president? Now,
we already know President Trump has brought up the term deep state. So obviously these amped up cyber wars now between the U.S. and Russia, the president has now called this story an act of treason. Your thoughts on that?
So he referred to it as treasonous. From what I have read so far, it sounds like he is accusing the New York Times of treason, while also saying the story is false, which is a little strange, right? It can't be both. It can't be false and treasonous on the part of the Times. However, in terms of the New York Times, it's not treasonous for the New York Times to report on this. If it is happening, the public needs to know. It is not treason for any news organization to report what is going on, whether the U.S. government likes it or not. If there is treason involved in this, however, or a treasonous action, it could be argued, I think, that those in this deep state who would be conducting these operations without the president knowing, that could be considered treasonous. How can we have a system, a nation of laws, a system set up in the way that it is, where we have a commander-in-chief who would not be aware of, again, potential military and cyber action against another nation? And so I think that there is a bigger question here, and what I think is most alarming, if you read most of the media reports on this, is that they tell it as if these actors within the U.S. Cyber Command are doing this because they don't trust Trump to be tough on Russia. That is still a treasonous act. You cannot act outside the purview of your commander simply because you don't like what you think they will do. It's incredible.
It's new times we're living in, Ben. As always, appreciate having you back on. We haven't seen you in a while. Ben Swann, thank you so much.
Manila, thanks.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.